As the crimson sun began rising over the ocean, Miria stepped back from her work and observed it as it emerged from the twilight, feeling satisfied. It might have been a strange reason to get up with the false dawn, but it felt right. For a week now, the local children had been scouring the beach for anything washed up by her ship and bringing it to her for identification. She had been dying to do this ever since one of them handed her a can of white spray paint. As the red sun painted the clouds overhead pink, and the peaks of the waves caught the light and became rubies, she could see the name Olan painted in 3-foot letters along the side of the ship. Now it had a name. Now she had personalized the body, just as she'd spent the night before personalizing the controls. And as she watched the beautiful sunrise, she finally found that peace she'd been fighting for ages. Today felt like a day for change. Today she was going to turn things around. Just before dawn, Nala had emerged from the jungle. She had watched Miria work for a moment, then shrugged and settled down on the sand to do her own meditation, to greet the dawn as was the custom of the people of the very oldest faith on the island. Edric was still snoring in the lean-to he had built on the outside of Miria's hut. Given the state of the hut after the Gorham raids, it probably was just as good shelter, she thought. She decided to let him sleep for a few minutes longer. For a moment she considered joining Nala in meditation, but then she noticed 2 figures coming up the beach. Rhea's blonde hair caught the light, turning into a fiery rose gold. She hadn't seen the other man around town, but then she hadn't spent much time there. He was broad-shouldered, wiry, and had chiseled abs. He might have been handsome if it weren't for the sour expression on his face, the casual slouch, and the way he moved that exuded arrogance about him. He carried an ornate halberd on his back, and a crossbow slung from his sash, but he wore no armor, only a vest that exposed his chest, and a pair of loose flowing pants that led down into simple shoes. His hair was bound up in a headband that was too ornately patterned to not have meaning. Something about his gait, the way he moved, while it was fluid, reminded her too much of a Confederate customs officer. She immediately disliked him.
Miria, let me introduce you to Garland. He's a monk of the Atreyu heresy.
When in doubt, open with humor.
Hello, Garland. I'm Miria. Please, tell me you're not here because you're repenting something and feel that the best way to do it is to watch my back?
Garland's sour face turned to confusion for a moment. What? No.
Good, 2 is enough of those. What exactly is the Atreyu heresy?
Her eyes turned to Rhea.
We'd managed to walk all the way to Colmax and back for me to answer that question, Miria. Absolute basics is that they're mercenaries. They spend their whole lives training both with weapons and to harden their bodies for close combat. Perfection through the way of the warrior.
Miria scanned Rhea for a moment. Was it now that she knew that Rhea was an actual teenager that she just had a bias here? Or could she smell pheromones?
Sounds like your kind of group. Why aren't you a member? They don't take women. And in fact, aren't interested in women in general.
Don't worry. I'm just here for the pay.
You're perfect. Climb aboard.
Nala rose without a word and joined him.
I'm gonna go wake Edric. Rhea, show them how to strap in.
Miria then wandered up to where Edric's feet stuck out of his lean-to and gave them a playful kick.
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Did I sleep in? You're fine. Just get aboard the ship. If you need to study your spell books, you can do it once we're lifting off. In the flying machine, yes? Are you sure it's perfectly safe?
Miria scanned the horizon. She could see the faint shimmer of drizzle coming in off the coast.
It probably isn't, but we have the right weather coming in for it. Come on, it's time to wake the all-knowing.
Reload your 3-bladed sword. Get comfortable in your chainmail bikini or your studded leather kirtle. Fire up the wizard van. It's about to get weird. Welcome to Swords Against Madness, an experimental fusion of solo tabletop role-playing game and psychedelic weird fantasy fiction. I'm playing Swords and Wizardry, a recreation of the original 1974 through 1978 rules of Dungeons & Dragons, combined with solo gaming tools like the Mythic Game Master emulator. I play the game, and then I turn it into a weird, pulpy story for your enjoyment. There are no rerolls or special rules to protect the characters. Just the dice and a fair-minded GM. And while I'm looking to create something like the weird, twisted science fiction and fantasy of the 1970s, I'm going to keep it PG, or at least what passed for PG when I was a kid in the 80s. If you didn't see it in Goonies, Gremlins, or Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, you won't hear about it here. But that's enough talk. It's time to get weird. Alright, it's time to take flight. Getting across Nar is going to be a lot easier in a starship, although it will make me lose a few opportunities. I didn't want to abuse the starship or use it as an easy shortcut to gaming play, so I decided that there would remain a risk that Yongu might shoot her down. If Miria is flying during the day, I want some trusty tech to have a chance of spotting her and Yongu ordering to open fire. That means things like the weather and cloud cover are going to be very important. So immediately I started scouring Swords and Wizardry for something that would tell me what the weather was like, and I couldn't find anything except a table on wind direction relevant to sailing. So I grabbed my rules cyclopedia, which sadly fell apart in my hands while I was running this session. I couldn't rightly find any useful weather tables there either. I went to my Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st Edition Dungeon Master's Guide. Once again, some things relevant to sailing, but not that are just going to give me a general weather system. I can see why John over at Tale of the Manticore and Simon at Legend of the Bones have created their own custom systems. But I was really eager to keep playing and not have to stop to build new mechanics, so instead I decided to steal a page out of my own Dungeon Master's book. Every Thursday night I play a game with a group of pretty hardcore D&D historians. We play Blueholm because it's about as close to the earliest version of D&D as you can get outside of Swords and Wizardry. The stated goal of that campaign is to recreate the experience of playing D&D as it would have been for the early playtesters and the wargaming crew out of the Twin Cities. We play a hacked version of Blueholm that has no thief class because there wasn't one in the original release of Dungeons & Dragons. And when we can, we reference notes in the back of the book The Lost Dungeons of Tonisborg, which is a book that details one of the first dungeons ever created by a D&D playtest group from before its release. It even includes a reconstruction of the rules they played with in 1972. We also use a lot of gaming conventions like a version of one-to-one time. The date of every Thursday matches up with the date of Thursday in the real world. In between sessions, my DM Steven figures out how much time there was between the end of the game session and next Thursday, and that's how much downtime we have between adventures. If you miss a week, then your character has another week of downtime. If your character has to go through a few weeks to train to level up, well, you can't use that character until he's free to join the campaign again. This makes for a very different, very immersive form of D&D. We've also included some conventions like there's a Braunstein going on in the background while we are playing. Various barons, cult leaders, goblin kings, and demons are being played by other players running a different level of the game in the background. So many of our adventure hooks come from the intrigues of the patron-level players. And it provided me with a near-perfect solution to my weather problem. Steven has synced up the weather in his campaign world to the weather in his hometown. If it has been rainy and miserable in Providence, Rhode Island, then it's rainy and miserable in Shoyenka. If he needs to know about a historical weather event, he can just grab an almanac or check a paper archive from the past. And if he needs to plan a grand event, he can just look at the weather forecast for the future. Now, of course, if I were using my local weather out of the greater Toronto area in Ontario, Nar wouldn't quite be the tropical paradise that I've been depicting it as. And I've imagined that this campaign is taking place in the early spring. So to get weather for a reasonably nice tropical island, I've been using the weather reports for the W.F. Wade International Airport in Bermuda, and I've been looking at the records for late March. On March 28th, the date that I synced this campaign to, the weather over Bermuda was cloudy, with a period of drizzle in the early afternoon. Perfect weather if cloud cover is what you're looking for, at least until about 3 o'clock. I can use this trick to determine how risky it is for Miria to fly the Ola. I can set a probability of Yongu and his men observing it flying based on how much cloud cover there is. With moderate cloud cover and light drizzle, it seems somewhat unlikely that Yongu is going to be able to spot her and take a shot at her from orbit. I rolled and Mythic told me no. They would be able to have a safe flight, at least up to the mountain. Things are going to get more interesting when the clouds burn off around 3 o'clock. This scene also introduces Garland. Garland is a first-level OD&D style monk. He has a strength of 14, intelligence of 9, a wisdom of 17, a dexterity of 6, a constitution of 11, and a charisma of 6. He has 2 hit points. It might also be helpful to point out that monks in original D&D were absolutely terrifying combatants. They couldn't wear armor and they only had a d4 of hit points, so they had to be circumspect about how they engaged. But every attack came with a chance of stunning or instantly killing your opponent if you rolled high enough over their armor class. They also had an ever-increasing bonus to damage with any weapon, and they were proficient with every weapon. And by the time they were just 4th level, they were doing as much damage with their bare hands as a sword anyway. By 5th level, there was no point in using the weapons unless you needed to attack from range. A monk also had a saving throw to deflect every single ranged attack aimed at them, and would eventually become immune to mind control, disease, poison, and be able to heal themselves simply by meditating. Even with only 2 hit points, Garland is an incredible asset to the party, assuming he can keep his distance, or back away from fights when things get ugly. It's a pity he also seems like an ill-tempered jerk.
Hi there, I hope you like what you're hearing. Today's sponsor is me, and my audio production company, Stormhead Productions. I want to help give you a voice, whether it's a video project, ads for the radio or internet, editing your podcast so you don't have to, or helping you plan everything from the very first ideas all the way down to your marketing strategy. Podcasts are my passion because I love helping other people express their passion. And I want to give you the tools to bring your ideas to the world. Check out my website, https://stormheadproductions.ca, and find out what I can do to help you get your voice out there. Or contact me on Twitter @StormheadAudio, and let me help you sound amazing.
The rush of supersonic flight had a different effect for every party member. For Miria, it was an old, comfortable feeling. She loved it. She lived for it. While she was at the controls, none of the horrors or losses of the last week seemed as real. And so she indulged herself, swinging around the island once at Mach 2 just for the sole joy of flying. The only time she didn't enjoy the flight was when she caught a strange rumbling sensation she couldn't place in the ship. It wasn't her ship, she didn't know it nearly as well, but that definitely shouldn't have been there. It took her a moment to realize that Edric was praying under his breath, desperately hoping that the Star People would spare him, or perhaps transmit him on a beam of light if the ship should fall. In the back, Rhea's usual confounded and surprised expression was tempered by a smile. When pillars of glowing death weren't falling from the sky, this was actually a lot of fun. She looked over and saw that Nala too seemed to be enjoying herself. Sitting a few seats apart, his arms folded, Garland affected his best brood, trying hard and failing to hide the fact that this was a terrifying experience for him. Members of his order never showed fear, not if they could help it. But in time, the flight had to end. Miria banked reluctantly back towards the mountain, towards its southeast face, as Edric had told her. Then she slowed and lowered herself, before nudging him.
I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn my inner eye to see its path. And where fear has gone, there will be nothing. Edric! Only I will remain. Edric!
Huh? Oh, yes?
We're nearly there. I need you to give me some guidance as to where to put down.
Edric scanned the mountain, confused for a moment. The act of scanning the mountainside helped him relax. It let some of the fear he'd been praying against finally go away. It took him only a moment to pick out landscapes from above.
There, that's where we need to put down. The entrance to the fane is at the back of that fissure. We'll have to do some climbing to get there.
Miria nodded and brought the ship into a gentle hover. Giving only the gentlest of pushes on the aileron, she slowly turned the ship, tilting it enough to let her see the ground, until she managed to pick out a useful landing spot. She then reached for the intercom.
I've got a spot to put us down. It's about a mile out, but it will do. Everyone brace yourselves for a landing.
What exactly do you mean, brace? But by then Miria had finished tapping her controls, and the ship gently drifted over to the spot she had designated as she folded her arms over her chest and placed her legs in a careful position. Nervously, Edric imitated her pose. As the ship drifted over to the landing spot she had designated, it lowered itself slowly and carefully, igniting some weeds clinging to the rocks, scattering pebbles, and kicking up dust. And then its legs extended. It cut power and landed with a heavy thud. Satisfied, Miria reached out and touched a panel, causing the engines to slowly wind to a halt, before unstrapping herself.
Come on, we've got a hike ahead of us.
The ramp whined open, setting down gently rather than allowing it to fall free as it had for Shosk and his minions. They were greeted with a rush of cool, wet mountain air and the sound of rain on stone. With the adrenaline worn off, Miria found that she was tired and weak from the medication. She had to lean on Nala from time to time as they worked their way up towards the canyon. As they carried up the slope, Rhea and Garland took the lead. Rhea suggested a marching order that put her and Garland at the front of a chevron, with Nala and Edric slightly behind and to the sides of them, and Miria safely at the back, between Nala and Edric.
If we're going to run into any traps or trouble, I want to make sure those of us who are skilled fighters are up front, and I want Miria to have the best cover possible. We're just wasting our time if she gets hurt.
I'm not here to play bodyguard. I'm here to be a sword, not a shield.
In my experience, people with that attitude end up separated from their group and die alone.
Don't worry, I can keep your hide intact, and still look out for my own best interests at the same time. Just remember what I'm here for, that's all.
As they entered the fissure, they were greeted with heat and a sulphurous smell. The light was dim and the air cloying. For a moment they all considered lighting a lantern, but then as they turned a bend, they were greeted with a pale orange light. The closer they got, the less mineral and more organic the smell became. It reminded almost all of them as garbage left out too long. And then they turned a corner and were greeted with a strange sight. The walls of the canyon were thick with some kind of grayish, slimy resin. It glistened in the light of a handful of glowing, pulsating head-sized nodules embedded in the walls of the canyon. In a few places, rabbits, snakes, deer, even a gorum could be seen encased in the goo, all in differing states of decay.
What is this?
Rhea turned to Edric, expecting some strange answer about alchemy. Through an Olympic feat, he looked more bewildered than her.
I don't know. I've never seen this before. It wasn't here the last time I was up. I'm not sure it's a creation of the Order of the Stars.
Well, there's no going around it if you want to finish your holy quest.
They took a few steps forward, and then suddenly a skittering sound and the falling of small rocks drew their attention upward. There was a chittering and a sudden clapping of elytra as a beetle almost the size of a man landed in front of them. It reared up hissing, casting a bright light all around it from orange glowing patterns across its shell and in nodules behind its eyes. Its movements were both threatening and dance-like. Before they could respond, 5 more of them came skittering out of holes in the walls or down from the cliff's edge or from around a corner. In a moment, the giant hissing insects had formed a half-moon around their ranks. They clattered mandibles the size of scimitars that looked just as sharp and wicked.
It's time for combat!
My party's just stumbled into a random encounter with 6 giant fire beetles. They've caught the party by surprise. And while, according to Mythic 2nd Edition, this encounter started off as a territorial display, once they got a feel for the size of the party, I rolled morale to see if the beetles were going to attack or simply try to scare them off. Unfortunately for my party, the beetles aren't scared. Mountains in D&D can be a dangerous place, and I made sure to establish a marching order ahead of time. While I prefer to play my games theater of the mind, sometimes it's very helpful to have an idea of who is where. In this case, I've got Rhea and Garland in the front rank, and then from left to right, Nala, Miria, and Edric in a rear rank. The beetles were able to surround the party, but I rolled that they started away far enough that they didn't have a chance to actually attack on the first round. By setting them up the way I have, every beetle can reach 2 targets. For example, the beetle on the extreme left can reach either Rhea or Nala, as can the second beetle. The third and fourth beetles can attack either Rhea or Garland. Then the last 2 beetles can choose to attack either Garland or Edric. Most of my party is pretty flimsy here. Giant fire beetles are also really hard to hurt. In order to hit them, my party had to roll a 15 or better on a d20. And for most of my party save Rhea, they had to roll considerably less. I'm outnumbered and outgunned here. I knew I was going to have to think fast or start losing player characters. Let me tell you how it went. There was a split second when Rhea felt like her heart had stopped, and then she lunged for her sword and drew it just as a handful of the beetles leapt at her. She could feel their pincers rattling against the plates of her armor. She felt one of them clamp onto her leg, but its mandibles were unable to pierce the nanofiber fabric she was wearing, causing more bruising than pain. She managed to swat away a third pair of mandibles and turned to see Garland moving like lightning. He dodged, rolled, and leapt to avoid the snapping mandibles of the beetles as he worked his glaive free and then began whirling it, trying to deter them. However balletic his movements, he could not seem to connect with the creatures. Rhea struck at the one grabbing hold of her leg with as much force as she could, but her blade simply glanced off of the hard chitin. To Miria's left, Nala had pulled out a sickle and was hacking away at one of the beetle's mandibles, but only causing light scoring at best. To her right, Edric seemed frozen, gripping his staff in a state of paralyzed fear. Miria bit her lip for a moment, and then began her spell, making a terrible choice. Just as Edric finally picked up his nerve and readied his quarterstaff, a wave of magic swept over the battlefield. And then 4 of the beetles, along with Garland and Edric, suddenly staggered for a moment, then slumped unconscious onto the ground. There was no way she could have placed that spell to knock out a lot of beetles without knocking out her own allies as well. And right now, that's a consequence she was going to have to accept. Now with only 2 of the giant beetles to contend with, she had time to collect her thoughts and choose her next target wisely. The 2 beetles that remained standing remained steadfastly focused on tearing apart Rhea, unaware that their hive mates had fallen into a deep magical sleep. Rhea growled and cursed as the creatures began to squeeze her limbs through the armor, but they couldn't make a dent. Unfortunately, neither could she as she hacked away over and over again at the chitin of the creature wrapped around her leg to no avail. Her friends' lives were on the line. Miria steadied herself, reached deep into the void, and then bent the warp. She grabbed hold of a magic missile from thin air, a ball of blazing purple energy, and flung it. It zipped through the air, leaving a trail of light as it navigated around Nala and struck the beetle she was hacking at in one of the orange phosphorescent pouches behind its eye. The pouch ruptured in an explosion of phosphorescent jelly, sprinkling its eyes and partially blinding it, and splashing Nala with luminescent chemicals. It let out a berserk shriek, refusing to let go and refusing to stop. even as the magical bolt burrowed deeper into its flesh and then fizzled out. Suddenly, Rhea let out a gasp of pain as the beetle on her right flank reared up and slashed its mandibles at her face. It cut her cheek deeply and clipped her ear. She staggered back, wincing from the pain. But in spite of her pain, she took advantage of the creature exposing its underbelly. She rolled her shoulder back and thrust her saber deep into the creature's gut. It let out a shriek as I-Force splashed on the ground. But even as she dealt it a crippling wound, the creature refused to relent. It pulled away before she could drive her saber any deeper into its thorax. Taking advantage of the fact that the beetle gripping Rhea's leg was suddenly disoriented, Nala raised her sickle and aimed carefully. She brought it down with both hands, separating the creature's head from its thorax. Desperate to help, Miria pulled the crystalline Arakeen bottle off of her hip and unstoppered it. She braced it against her leg and spoke an ancient magic word she had been forced to memorize, hoping that both bottles were attuned to the same commands. There was a sudden roar as water burst out of the end of the bottle at geyser forces, sweeping the beetle off of its feet and sliding it across the ground until it was pinned against a rock. Writhing and hissing, the beetle struggled against the torrent for a moment, then finally managed to twist itself free of the stream of water, turned and began skittering back up the canyon. It only made it halfway up before there was a screech of laser fire, and the creature exploded into a shower of guts and phosphorescence. Rhea stood with her chest heaving as she lowered the laser rifle and scanned the area for more beetles.
Kill the other ones before they wake up.
And then it was over. A few swings of a sickle, and the creatures were dead, as Miria gently splashed small trickles of cold water from the bottle to wake Garland and Edric. Well, that was a close one. At the end of the battle, only one party member got hurt. Rhea now sits at 3 of 8 hit points. And Miria has managed to expend all of her spells. Thankfully, she had the Arakeen bottle, which is my nickname for the decanter of endless water. I rolled it as a random magic item, and couldn't have been more pleased. The decanter of endless water is one of my favorite items in D&D. It is a bottle that creates fresh water. It can either be poured in a gentle trickle, create a fountain, or blast like a geyser depending on which command word you use. In past D&D campaigns, I've used it for everything from riot control to putting out fires, to keeping a party alive while stranded in a desert, to even flooding out a colony of kobolds. When I got the item, I decided to check with the Mythic Game Master emulator as to whether or not Miria might be familiar with it. Swords and Wizardry doesn't have formalized rules like later editions of D&D for identifying magic items, which is actually one of the things I love about Swords and Wizardry. It's so artfully incomplete. Like the original Dungeons & Dragons, it encourages you to make up your own rules. In this case, I decided that Miria would have a nearly impossible chance of knowing what the Decanter of Endless Water was, but rolled on Mythic Game Master emulator and rolled 100. An extreme yes, she knew exactly what this item was, and exactly how to use it, and had history with something like it in the past. Perhaps when the next adventure is all said and done, if she can find a moment's peace, we'll have a chance to figure out exactly why it is she knows so much about decanters of endless water. In the meantime, nothing more stands between them and the Fane of the All-Knowing. Swords Against Madness was written, directed, played, and GM'd by Brian C. Rideout. Editing and production was done by Stormhead Productions, which is also Brian Rideout. I have generated the music in this series using the Suno AI. For show notes and more information, visit swordsvmadness.stormheadproductions.ca. You can reach me on X at swordsvmadness, and you can email me at swordsvmadness@stormheadproductions.ca. And until next time, roll high, play hard, and think weird.